Let me read to you a passage from the 6th chapter of St. John's Gospel, verses 1 to 15. It's the Gospel for the 17th Sunday in Ordinary Time Year B. St. John writes, "Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far side of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish feast of Passover was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?' He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite.' Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. 'Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?' Jesus said, 'Make the people sit down.' There was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, 'Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted.' So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, 'Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world.' Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself." That's from John chapter 6, verses 1 to 15. What does it suggest to us? Well, it is to be noticed that generally when St. John in his Gospel refers to a miracle worked by our Lord, he uses the term sign. The first of the miracles that he reports is that of the wedding feast of Cana. It was the first of the signs that Jesus did, and it manifested his glory, as we read in chapter 3, verse 12. In our Gospel passage today that I read, our Lord works another sign, chapter 6, verse 14. In the first sign, he provided wine for the wedding feast. In this sign, he provides food for a vast crowd. Now, just prior to his account of this feeding of the crowd, John provides us with a clue as to what the miracle was a sign of. It occurred, he tells us, when, and I quote, "the Jewish Passover feast was near." Now, why would he mention this? The obvious reason why St. John tells us that the miracle of the loaves occurred near the time of the Passover feast is because it was a sign of what our Lord would do at his final Passover feast. At his final Passover feast, the night before he died, he instituted the greatest of the sacraments, the Holy Eucharist. At that Passover meal, by his divine power, he changed the bread into his body and the wine into his blood and gave it to his disciples. And they were to do this in memory of him. And in this way, all his disciples would be fed with this bread from heaven, which is himself. Now this whole chapter 6, in which is described the miracle of the loaves, may be said to be given over to Christ's teaching on the Eucharist. It begins with Christ feeding the multitudes with a few loaves by a great act of power. It passes on to another proof of his divine power when he miraculously walks on the water to the disciples who are under difficulty on the sea. He joins them, and in no time they arrive at their destination. Then begins the main and momentous part of the chapter, our Lord's lengthy teaching on the Holy Eucharist in the synagogue of Capernaum. It is obvious that the miracle of the loaves is not only a sign of Christ's concern for those in need, in this case those who are hungry, but it is also a sign of the Holy Eucharist. It is a sign of the Eucharist in many respects, but especially of the Eucharist as the new Paschal meal. The Paschal feast of the Jews was the great celebration in every family of the passing over of the houses of the Hebrews by the angel as he made his terrible visits to the houses of the Egyptians. Meanwhile, the Hebrew family ate their meal in haste and readiness. It was the first Passover meal. The Pharaoh had refused to allow the Hebrews to go out into the wilderness to worship God. In punishment, the firstborn of every Egyptian family was taken, and this catastrophe forced the Pharaoh to allow the Hebrews to go. The angels passing over was the sign of their deliverance soon to come, and every year the Hebrew family celebrated the Passover meal, which now was the memorial of that great deliverance. Our Lord's feeding of the multitudes near the Passover feast is a reminder of the new Passover feast he would institute during his last celebration of the old. It was the new Passover meal, the new Pasch, but this time far more than a reminder of a past deliverance. The deliverance which Christ as the new Moses would effect would be the definitive deliverance from sin. He, the new Moses of the new people of God, his church, would take away the sin of the world. He would lead his people out of the slavery of sin into the promised land of life in God. And this he would do by his death on the cross as the new Paschal lamb sacrificed on behalf of all mankind. The Mass, the great Paschal meal which he would institute at his last Passover, would not only be a constant memorial of this deliverance, but would actually make it present. This Passover meal of Christ would be the means whereby he, the bread of life, would be fed to the multitudes of the world. By eating of this heavenly bread, the believer would be united to Christ in his sacrifice as victim on the cross. The miracle of the loaves was a sign of the greatest thing that would continue on in the world till the end of time. That was the new Paschal meal, which is the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist. Let us think of Christ feeding the multitudes with a handful of loaves and a few fish. It is near the feast of the Passover. Let our minds pass to Christ's final Passover meal on the night he was betrayed. The Holy Eucharist is instituted, and together with that, the ministerial priesthood by which the Holy Eucharist would be brought to the peoples. Let us ask our Lord for a deep appreciation of the mystery of the Eucharist, which is the summit and the source of the Christian life, the greatest means that has been given to us of union with Christ, in whom is every heavenly blessing.